All right. Okay, so we'll give people a chance to jump on. I did not widely publicize this, but I think what we're going to be able to do is give people a full picture in the limited time that we have. You were on the east side of the Capitol. I was on the west. So we can talk about that. I'm also very interested in this Atlantic piece that came out in which they characterized the people that were there. And what's very surprising is the very limited number of affiliations of the 193 people that were arrested. There were very few affiliations. And I think that'll be consistent. We'll be able to talk to people about that. But first things first, I'm here with Ford Fischer. Ford, tell us about your organization and who you are.
Right. So my organization is called News to Share, which basically is a platform I use, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and newstoshare.com to broadcast live streams of political activism and produce raw footage of those situations, which both go directly to my audience as well as for the purposes of being licensed to other news outlets. So just sort of in reference to the last month, the sort of situation that Jeremy is referring to, I of course directly broadcasted, what I filmed to my own audience, but my work has also been used on NBC, CNN, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, the BBC, the list goes on. So kind of the purpose of my work is to create raw, unabridged, objective content without any political leaning that shows political activism in action, such that then others can share, analyze, and include it in their bodies of work as well.
And the key word there, objective, in the sense that I think when we start talking to each other, because there's a few of us that have been out there. Now, you longer than any of us. You've been doing this since before Charlottesville, right?
Yeah. Yes, long before Charlottesville.
Right, even before Charlottesville. So that's going to have to be a longer discussion for another time. But what's exciting is that there's enough of us that are out there that when we have these conversations, people are going to be able to get an idea of what we saw and how it played out, who was there, and that it might be very different than what mass media is portraying to people. And that's the sense that I'm getting from that people are starting to listen a little bit more. This Atlantic piece that came out, it just came out in the last 2 days, and it's titled "The Capitol Rioters Aren't Like Extremists as You Would Expect Them to Be." That's the overall arc of that piece. And I actually contacted the authors who are from Chicago, something called the Chicago Project on Security. And I have some really interesting breaking information. But before we get to that, what's going on with you? Your YouTube channel, I've seen some of your posts over the last couple of days. We're dealing in this era of mass sort of hyper control of social media platforms. And it seems like there's no immunity, that anybody can get struck down. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so what's actually really fascinating about this, so I've had a YouTube channel since 2014, and I guess I've been monetized since then, although since graduating college in 2016, it's been a really meaningful part of my life. I mean, this is what I do full-time, is film events, both to generate ad revenue online, but also to license to other outlets. And so when a platform like YouTube demonetizes me, it really actually cuts to the core of my income.
And it demonetized your whole channel.
To be clear, yeah. So it was already actually pretty normal, and I think understandable, even if sometimes I found it frustrating, that individual videos would sometimes be demonetized, right? If I'm going to film the Capitol insurrection happen, right, 5 people died at it, fine. You want to market violence and then say no ads on this particular video, I'm actually okay with that. I think I'm trying to frame my thumbs up but the problem is that, so this happened to me once in 2019, and it just happened again like an hour ago or 2 hours ago now, that YouTube has, on some content creators and now me, demonetized the entire channel, where even though my channel matches, in my opinion, every community guideline, I certainly don't post any kind of extremist content. I personally don't do anything that would advocate, for example, claims that the election was stolen, which is a sort of banned kind of point to make on YouTube, right? I don't do any of the stuff that YouTube is trying to weed out when it demonetizes and removes videos. And yet, so a week ago, a video that I had from the day of the of the January 6th insurrection, but earlier in the day, before the violence started, of just the audience reacting to President Trump's speech. I posted that, a uncut 70-minute, here's the audience reacting to President Trump's speech on the day of J6. And a week ago, on the day that the House delivered the articles of impeachment to the Senate, accusing him of incitement of insurrection for that speech, YouTube took down that video. And they said that that video propagates false election fraud claims. And of course, it's not true that it says that the election was a fraud or anything like that. President Trump surely said that, and President Trump's voice is surely audible in the video. But me as a content creator, I am posting documentary footage of that situation, right. And it is useful for our understanding of that situation, as evidenced by the fact that BBC bought the rights to use that footage from me. In spite of that, YouTube says, no good. They took it down. And so I've spent the last week sort of doing advocacy to put that video back up. And at first they were not replying. And then finally yesterday, they responded after just mountaining pressure onto them and getting the attention of Forbes magazine, as well as some other breaching into the mainstream. And what ended up happening was they replied that it didn't have the contradicting view against the president's claim, that their issue was that it needed the context of somebody else in the video saying, no, Trump is wrong. This is ridiculous. It's not that my video was obviously not presenting the claim that the election was stolen. My video was showing this is what happened on this date at this time. And so offering some kind of contradiction to it doesn't make any sense. When I replied and kind of described the sort of nonsense of their claim, it seems like, less than 24 hours later, they demonetized the entire channel. And so I don't want to say that it was like retaliation for advocating over that particular video. Maybe it was just that my arguing with them caused them to have renewed attention to my channel, and then they found something else that they considered problematic. But they don't give any details whatsoever in their takedown. It literally just says, I could pull it up right now to make sure that I get the wording right, but it is completely detailless. It says harmful content that focuses on controversial issues and that is harmful to viewers. That doesn't tell me anything. I have no idea what their problem is. And so I will say, I'm not going to say in their defense, but literally since getting on this podcast with you, I saw that I got a private message from YouTube saying, we just sent you an email if you want to be in touch, kind of in the background. So I think I've spooked them enough by advocating about this that they're at least going to start talking to me like a human being. But I think that it's emblematic of a wider issue, where algorithms are making these moderation decisions. Maybe humans are pressing a button to validate them, but clearly they're not spending a lot of time thinking hard about what they're doing.
Yeah, especially if you're just presenting. From what I gathered, that was at the Ellipse.
So it was just south of the Ellipse. So President Trump, then President Trump, was speaking on the Ellipse, which is sort of a secured area. And most of the mainstream media news cameras were directed at Trump from within the Ellipse. And that meant that, all these mainstream news sites, by the way, have their own videos of President Trump speaking, and that has no problem. And it's just, a medium shot right on the former president. But for me, of course, I didn't want to go in that spot. I mean, maybe I could have with my White House credentials, but I went to the National Mall and I wanted to be in the middle of the actual people listening to it. Most of the people listening to that speech were listening to it there was gigantic projectors, so people were hearing his voice. And those are the people who were called to march and actually able to march directly, right? The people immediately around Trump are in a secured area. It's harder for them to move. But when President Trump said, we're all going to march to the Capitol, I was among the people who then did that and participated in the Capitol insurrection. And so I think my footage showing, for example, that when he said that America has elections like a third world country, that the audience chanted, fight for Trump, fight for Trump. I think that's a really critical moment in history. And I don't understand how YouTube could disagree with that, given that that moment is cited in the in the impeachment report by the House Democrats, and Trump's lawyers had to reply to it and also mention these exact moments, although they say that it wasn't Trump's fault, that Trump didn't incite them. So people are going to have honest disagreements. I understand that Trump's lawyers are going to say he didn't incite, Democrats are going to say he did incite, but the truth of the matter, the actual truth, is only going to be visible if we have video of it, and YouTube doesn't want people to see that, and I, for the life of me, can't understand why.
I can't either. I don't think anything, quite frankly, should be censored. I think that we all need to be able to sift through all of this and have access to it. Somebody asks, is your content available somewhere else? So, for example, that stream that we're talking about, is that available on another platform?
Generally speaking, I post on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. YouTube, to be clear, has only deleted that one video, although they've demonetized my entire channel. And so I obviously find that deeply problematic, but most of my content is still there on YouTube, at least to watch, even if I don't make a cent off of it anymore. I have started using in the last week, because of this exact concern, there's a site called Odyssey, which automatically backs up your YouTube videos. Some tech people at Minds reach out to me and said that the same feature exists there. So I'm going to start basically backing up my YouTube videos to Minds and Odyssey. But I would also say that my Facebook has the same content, and Twitter has marked my entire profile as sensitive content. So I'm effectively shadow banned on Twitter. But if you go to Twitter to look at my content, then it is also accessible there.
All right. Well, I'm glad that a real person seems to be, fingers crossed, reaching out to you. If you can get through, then we'll get an update on that.
Fingers crossed, indeed.
Yeah, exactly. I want to talk about the Capitol. Again, you were on the east side, and the last time that we talked, it seemed that the Oath Keepers were on your side of the Capitol. I was on the west side, and I was in probably what was the very last group that was trying to break in. The bullhorn lady was there, and that video is a whole other story of how that video was used by mass media. This Atlantic article, the Capitol rioters aren't like other extremists, or how you would expect. I don't have the exact title in front of me, but it came out in the last 2 days, and it's interesting because they look at 193 arrests. And of those 193, they say only 1/10 of those arrested had any sort of militia affiliation. In other words, Oath Keepers, 3%ers, or Proud Boys. They also said, and this is from something called the Chicago Project that wrote the Atlantic piece, they also said they erred on inclusion. So if they thought somebody could be tied to repping 3%ers, obviously there are people that show up with shirts on and flags that aren't necessarily card-carrying members of a militia group. But they erred on inclusion, and only 1/10 of those 193 people arrested belong to any sort of, or were repping any kind of affiliation. Does that surprise you? What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, so I think that January 6th was a really unique situation in the sense that, like, when I have covered other situations that have really extreme outcomes, so using Charlottesville as an example, like, that was a coalition of basically Nazis and people who felt very comfortable marching alongside Nazis, right? And that attracted groups with names, right? Hierarchical structures, right? Leaders, whatever. And of course individuals, but like, it attracted more people in organized groups. And I would say that this is also true of the left, right? When a situation happens, we're calling for a demonstration at this place at this time. There might not be as obvious of group affiliation, but there's at least sort of an identity affiliation, right? There's no such thing as an Antifa membership card. But if somebody is going to a event, sort of posted in Portland by local anti-fascists, and they show up in Black Bloc to participate, I think it's probably fair to call them an anti-fascist activist. The thing about January 6th was that it really was an unusual perfect storm, in that President Trump himself was telling people to be there, and he said, be there and be wild. And then, so you had this enormous outcome in Washington, D.C., not unlike Trump rallies, where I've been to, for example, Hershey, Pennsylvania, where I think he packed like 20 or 30,000 people into a stadium, right? President Trump had a very unique ability to bring a lot of people physically to an event. And their uniting element is that they are Trump supporters. And what's interesting is that, the previous 2 million MAGA March events, for the most part, those sorts of people, basically just your average Trump supporter who just came because they support the president, didn't really engage as much in violence. The violence, the vandalism, and so forth was more like organized groups. The Proud Boys stayed together at night. They marched through the city looking for Antifa to fight with. They took a sign or a banner, off of a church and set it on fire, right? Like that was an organized group. In the situation of January 6th, people were simply united by their belief that the election was stolen, and that was the uniting factor. And I think that some people might dislike what I'm about to say because they'll say that it like legitimizes the incitement of insurrection charge. But I mean, in a way, I think that Trump became the de facto leader in the same way that the Oath Keepers might have a specific sort of lieutenant, or the Proud Boys have a chairman. When Donald Trump said, march to the Capitol, and before that he said, be wild. And during his speech, he said, we have to fight, because if we don't fight, we're not going to have a country anymore. I think when he said all of those things, President Trump sort of made himself be that unifying element that causes people to have a crowd mentality. I was surprised that at the Capitol, Trump supporters, for the most part, say that they support law and order. They say that they support law enforcement. You have to obey law enforcement or else you deserve to be shot. I've heard some of them say in the most extreme. And yet they stormed through the Capitol, and they're storming past police. One police officer died, hundreds were injured, right? So it's like, where did that difference come from? And I think it was basically a crowd mentality that although President Trump wasn't physically there with them, they literally thought that he was going to be. President Trump said, I will be there with you. I think that psychologically, the situation that unfolded was basically the same as if they had a leader. It's just that President Trump wasn't actually there.
A weird thing that I mentioned in the end of the 5 o'clock hour, when the last groups were being cleared out, mostly by Virginia State Police who had come onto the scene on the west side, I saw this weird Jekyll and Hyde thing of some people were yelling at the cops, calling them oath breakers, which we saw. And then other people were thanking the cops for their service. It was this very strange, surreal, Jekyll and Hyde kind of vibe.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that this is actually a point that you and I talked about, I think, the last time that I spoke with you, which is that during the last 4 years, until January, Trump supporters basically supported the government that was in power. And people who opposed them were essentially, ranging from just political activists to actual dissidents. Like, we want to remove that person from power. And so when President Trump lost the election, I think there was a transition among Trump supporters that turns them from more like, in the case of those who fight, more like a paramilitary who supports the state in power, to more like an insurgency that believes that the incoming government is illegitimate. And I think that attitude difference is perfectly visible on the street. Where political forces sort of do battle. I think that the people who feel the grip of government sort of falling away, it makes sense that they would naturally end up strifing with the police, who are ultimately the enforcers of the state.
I want to talk about, while I still got you, because I know you do have to go, especially in light of Charlottesville. I think mass media, in some ways, people I know that I spoke with immediately assumed that the crowd that was there was Charlottesville times 1,000 or something. That it seems that white supremacy made it into the headlines. Now we're seeing white privilege making it into the headlines a little bit more if they're toning that narrative down. But my big question had always been to the Southern Poverty Law Center. I was on their conference on Monday. Do we know of any platform white supremacist groups or gangs that were involved? Because as I described the crowd, the people that I interviewed, Again, they said it's only this 1 in 10 of the people arrested belong to the Oath Keepers or these militia-like groups. Now, when I asked further, I got a very interesting statement that I want to read to you. And again, this is from the Atlantic. The Capitol rioters aren't like other extremists. I would almost say it was almost like a kind of populist extremism. You mentioned, the uniting factor here was the President of the United States. One thing I do want to mention, a lot of us were caught flat-footed because we expected the fighting to be at night. You mentioned
I felt strongly about that, yes.
You had the same exact mindset?
I felt that it was quite possible that individual extremists could perform sort of acts of terrorism essentially during the day. I was very concerned, and indeed the only reason that I didn't wear like a bulletproof vest actually was that in some cases it can cause the police to make issues with you. But I was concerned that, what if one individual or something brought like a firearm? What if somebody attempted to physically stop the event from happening? I thought that would look like perhaps individual acts of terror. The fact that pipe bombs, by the way, were left at the RNC and the DNC has largely been forgotten about in history, even though the assailant hasn't been caught. And
the night before, too.
And that was left the night before, but presumably because of January 6th coming.
Right.
I personally was much more concerned that during the day things like that would happen, and then you would have a very angry Trump-supporting crowd in Washington, D.C., who would be disappointed by the results of the certification and then might be marching around at night. What I did not anticipate was that en masse, you'd be able to see a crowd that typically is compliant with the police evolve into a riot structure with so many people completely willing to participate. I had never seen anything like that in my life, and I doubt if I ever will again. But it was extremely unusual, and I think I had predicted that there could be serious violence, but I did not think that there would be serious violence with hundreds of people involved.
Right. No. And the Atlantic article, I think, estimates the number of people that went into the Capitol. They talk about 193 being arrested, but they estimate about 4 times that having entered the Capitol.
Right.
And when you refer to, again, I didn't even bring my gas mask with with me. When
you must have regretted that.
Yeah, I did eventually at that. But what we're talking about as far as precedent is people should know there were these mass rallies on November the 14th, the Million MAGA March 1, and then there was a second one on December the 12th. So we had been in a holding pattern of seeing peaceful protests that were, spirited, but spread across Washington, D.C. during the day. And then the combat, the street fighting, took place at sundown. Of course, that being launched on November the 14th with widespread attacks that came from the left to normie Trump supporters that were crossing near Black Lives Matter Plaza. So we had this precedent of what we imagined, I think, what was going to happen. And
I thought it would basically be an extreme version of what happened in November and December.
Right. And December, even more so. December was, you had, roaming groups of Proud Boys that were going through alleys trying to come out on the other side. You had the stabbing that was near Harry's bar.
They were eager to fight, I guess is probably the way that I would characterize it. I mean, literally, they were telling the police, like, just give us 1 hour with them, right? Like, suggesting that they would somehow, neutralize an entire political faction by beating them up.
Right. No, they're and you saw that where the police by the end of the night, they were trying to keep the big mass of Proud Boys led marchers from getting even close to BLM Plaza. And that was a standoff right outside the Capitol Hilton there, which is about a half a block away. I just want to get your reaction to this. So I contacted one of the authors of The Atlantic.
And let me just say that I'm happy to answer whatever you're about to ask, but I think that'll have to be my last one.
Right. I just want to get your reaction.
Sure.
You can hop off, and then I'll try to go back and.
I'm happy to talk again soon.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we have a lot
Catch up on.
to catch up on. But
Yep.
this is what's interesting. When I was pressing the Southern Poverty Law Center, who I had a representative that was assigned to me through the Southern Poverty Law Center back in June. That's because at the time I was investigating whether Proud Boys were instigating civil unrest under Black Lives Matter. I was interested. I was tailing them in Tulsa. I was trying to figure out if there was widespread infiltration. Now, what I came to understand was that was not the case. Now, once that happened, unfortunately, the Southern Poverty Law Center wasn't very interested in what I was finding out, all the way to the hate crime that was charged October the 17th in San Francisco, when it came to reporting on violence that was coming from the left. So I've been pressing them to say, they held this press conference on Monday. They were talking about white supremacy and hate groups. And I was really trying to get an answer out of, do we know that any white supremacist groups were represented? We have the guy with the Camp Auschwitz, hoodie. We have him. And I actually interviewed a guy who said he was a self-proclaimed extremist, said he had National Socialist sympathies. So that's that's a larger discussion. It was basically a confession of, he said he had studied hundreds of hours of leftist black bloc techniques himself. And this was the day after, on the 7th, he showed up.
Okay.
So I know those two guys exist. But I was trying to get from the SPLC what platform groups were there, because we know the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters and the Proud Boys to be more militia type groups and not ethno-nationalists.
Yeah, I would not. I mean, I wouldn't call the Proud Boys a militia, but I understand your point, which is that their stated objective is sort of civic nationalism. It's like political nationalism that they would say is race blind. But I think to answer your question about basically my understanding of sort of avowed supremacist or hate groups that were present there, I would say that for the most part, there's been an evolution since Charlottesville where white supremacist groups have largely disaffiliated because Charlottesville really destroyed them economically, socially, and so forth. And so it's much more common to see people organize around language like America First and so forth. And so that's not discounting their sort of presence among the crowd, but I think that you'd be hard pressed to find ostensible white supremacist groups who would announce that they were present there. With that being said, for example, Nick Fuentes is he has told me in an interview in, I believe, early 2019, he described himself to me as a white majoritarian. I asked, are you a white nationalist? And he said, well, I think I'm a white majoritarian. And so I asked him, what does that mean? And he described that he basically has I'm not going to go into the details of it, but his philosophy was essentially a soft version of white nationalism. And of course, Nick Fuentes made it into Nancy Pelosi's office. I'm sorry. I'm taking that back. That's not true. That's not correct. Yeah. Baked Alaska made it into Nancy Pelosi's office. Nick Fuentes was present at the Capitol. I want to make sure that, because people are going to take that out of context and say that I got it wrong. So I'm making this extremely clear. Nick Fuentes was not inside the Capitol, as far as we know. Nick Fuentes was a
doppelganger picture.
There was a guy who looked a lot like him who was next to Baked Alaska. But so Nick Fuentes, though, leads the kind of America First movement, he calls it, but it really goes politically into a place that is not Trump's America First philosophy. He uses Trumpist language, but he calls for an end to all immigration, period. And he tends to say that he is not a conservative, but rather he's a nationalist and so forth. And so it's a lot of dog whistling about race and migration related to demographics. So I think that
they have a flag. They have a flag.
And they do have the flag that says AF.
Right. And that flag was in the Capitol.
And so followers of his were certainly there, although participation in the Nick Fuentes groypers, they often call themselves. They're basically openly anti-Semitic, right? At the Trump speech, some of those guys were chanting at people who had Israeli flags, Trump supporters with Israeli flags. They were chanting at them, shame, shame, shame. Obviously because of the Jewish, Star of David, being on those flags. So the anti-Semitism among many of them is pretty obvious. And what I had mixed up earlier before was Baked Alaska is the kind of pseudonym used by this guy. I forget how to pronounce his last name, but his first name's Tim. And he was a slated speaker at Charlottesville. And so while I don't know exactly the way he's describing his political ideology nowadays, he certainly was part of the kind of loosely knit white nationalist coalition that participated in what has now been called historically the Summer of Hate in 2017. So, I think that it would be hard to say that there were coordinated white nationalist or white supremacist groups at the Capitol, but I think you can kind of name examples of white nationalist leaning people or white nationalist tolerant people who attended.
Right. And someone had asked earlier if the Atlantic's the publication by the Atlantic, rather, of this Chicago Project report had included Q as well. So this doesn't give, and I think what it tells us is that we're dealing with populist extremism in some ways, that it all blends together. And as you signified at the beginning of this conversation, and I have said in other conversations as well, that you really do have to lay everything at the feet of Donald Trump, because that's what unites it all.
Right. And so I'll I guess leave on this note, which is to say that the coalition that kind of participated in that, I think, was the final step in an evolution that happened in conservative politics generally, which is that Trump supporters and supporting Trump became simply about supporting him. And so there was this siphoning off of Republicans and conservatives who were not Trump loyalists, I think, over the last 4 years, who have largely been recharacterized as rhinos and that kind of thing. I mean, I think that probably the most extreme example of this would be that the RNC didn't even create a new platform in 2020. They simply said that their support for the president's reelection was their platform. And so Trumpism quite literally was the 2020 platform of the Republican Party, which, although Trump certainly stands for things, and I'm not going to say that worship of Trump is literally all that Trump is about, the Republican platform was Trump. And that was the unifying factor, to the point that, it was interesting to see who's going to be over the Trump administration. Like, Trump is throwing people off. Oh, Steve Bannon, he's now sloppy Steve, right? Lindsey Graham, oh, he's weak, and all of that kind of stuff. Mitch McConnell, oh, he didn't support me to the end. On the very last day, January 6th, not that was the last day of the presidency, but, like leading up to that kind of climax of the Trump presidency, a big part, which I hope is not lost in history, of that event and its motivation was Trump was saying, we need Mike Pence to have courage. We're marching to the Capitol to tell Mike Pence to overthrow the election. Trump wasn't saying, let's march to the Capitol to, while I think that this ended up being a natural consequence in a way, Trump wasn't saying, like, let's go there and like harass the Democrats. Let's go there and try to convince AOC to vote differently or something, like, whatever. And of course, she wasn't in the Senate, but because she was sort of a victim, as she described, of the, having to hide and so forth. I'm just being clear about that. Trump's instruction was go there to motivate Republican senators and go there to give courage to Mike Pence. And so in a way, it was really the final step, where when you get to the point that Trump supporters are chanting at the Capitol, hang Mike Pence, right, as Mike Pence has to be evacuated, presumably to prevent the possibility of him being killed by these people. I think that is the obvious final step of that coalition siphoning down their support into just Trumpism. Mike Pence was the number 2 man of the Trump administration. If President Trump had died, Mike Pence would have been the president, the person that Trump chose to have that position. And they got to the point that hang Mike Pence was a pro-Trump call.
Yeah, over something that he had no power to do anyway.
Over something, and they might disagree with that. But yes, I mean, I think that basically any constitutional scholar or journalist would say, Vice President Pence had no constitutional authority to overturn the election after the state certified it a different way.
His role was procedural, and I think that's being the right-wing media is trying to do their best to emphasize that point. Look, I know you need to go. I'm going to read what that statement was to the rest of the audience, but basically what it comes down to is they didn't find any white supremacist gang affiliations.
Right.
And we could go into that because, again, you were there in Charlottesville. I'm sure you'll be able to enlighten me as far as the evolution of groups and so forth in this new kind of extremism that we were, witness to on January the 6th. But I know you got to go, and good luck with your YouTube channel and everything.
You bet. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks, Ford.
Bye.
Great. All right. So that was Ford Fischer, you guys. News to share. Check him out. What's really exciting is that there are a few of us. Another guy, Brendan Gutenschwager, if you guys follow him on Twitter, he is everywhere. And like Ford, he's an independent. I'm just going to fix this. Sorry, this fell out earlier. He's an independent. And wait, I don't even need this in anymore. I'm not talking to anybody. What am I doing? Ford and Brendan are independents. And so what's exciting about their work is it is ostensibly objective. I try to be objective too. Now, obviously, when we have a conversation like this on a podcast, we're trying to sort of put things into context, decipher what we see out on the street with as little political motivation as possible. Now, there are guys out there that we saw routinely who are right-wing guys who are with the Blaze, and the Daily Caller is different because the Daily Caller's team actually put up a ton of video that wasn't partisan. They would show it regardless of whether it looked good for the right or looked bad for the right, whether it looked good for the left or bad for the left. I think that said, a lot of what we saw in the last year was majority looked bad for the left. So that's not a hard position if you're the Daily Caller to take. Let's be honest. But somebody like me, I come from the left. I've never voted for a right-wing candidate ever. I'm very honest about that. Where I was born in Berkeley, California. My parents met at the university there, and so during the '60s of all time. So I'm culturally from that, and I'm honest about it because I also want to address what I see as a certain kind of fanaticism that's running amok and a media that's blind to it or doesn't want to discuss it. So a lot of what I have seen as far as the trajectory from late May when I got involved in this story has been a lot of selective outrage about certain extremist groups and then no scrutiny whatsoever from others. And that's what I'm interested in bringing this Southern Poverty Law Center into conversation. The ADL is another group that I was in contact with in June when I went to Tulsa, and I tailed the Proud Boys in Tulsa. If you go to my website, it's publicreport.org. You scroll halfway down, you can see the video where I tailed the Proud Boys. And once I realized that there was no major infiltration on the right, but that there was organized revolutionary politics has gone back in my lifetime to, the late 80s rather, that you have, in my first conversation with Brett Weinstein, I talk a lot about Anti-Racist Action Network, the Baldies, which was a anti-racist skinhead gang in Minneapolis that helped usher in the Anti-Racist Action Network. And that was all through the 90s. The framework of that, according to one anarchist insider who is from the Midwest, the framework of anti-racist action from the 90s, that's what we're still seeing in terms of what modern day loosely networked Antifa groups are. So I'm going to read for you the response from the group, the Chicago Project, which the full name of the Chicago Project is called the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. They're the ones who authored the Atlantic piece which is headlined, "The Capitol Rioters Aren't Like Other Extremists." On publicreport.org, I mentioned this report, and I will update it with this statement, which they gave directly to me. Nobody else has this. So you guys are going to hear essentially what is a very interesting piece of news. This is what one of the authors wrote me in my continued quest, I guess, because with the Southern Poverty Law Center, I was in their press conference on Monday. I was trying to find out, are there platform white supremacist groups that were involved in the Capitol? This is what they wrote me. There was only one person among the 193 arrested for attacking the Capitol with any gang affiliation. The chart does not specify the type. So in that article, they had a chart. They said that 1%, they rounded up, because it was only one person who had any sort of ethno-gang affiliation. And then they go on to say, the gang in question is the Latin Kings, not a white nationalist gang. We found no evidence of specifically white nationalist gangs, parentheses, skinheads, Hammerskins, Aryan Brotherhood, etc., among the arrested. I hope this answers your question. So I find that extremely interesting, especially because if you have no representation amidst the Capitol riot, but you actually did have one verified white nationalist that was involved in the George Floyd riots, who may have been or may have not been an infiltrator. This is the person known as Umbrella Man, who very famously, before the night before the 3rd Precinct was sacked, he is the one who broke out the windows of the AutoZone. The AutoZone fire was the first major, business that was torched in Minneapolis. That Umbrella Man, according to the Minneapolis Star, their report and what the police affidavit showed is they filed a warrant for his phone records. He was a suspected Hell's Angel and a member of a motorcycle gang called the Aryan Brotherhood. So we got one in Minneapolis, but we didn't find those affiliations on January 6th. Now, that does not mean that there were not racists there. As Ford and I discussed, the America First Groyper Nick Fuentes group was represented, and their flag, though that was a doppelganger that Ford misspoke and said was in the Capitol, it was not him from what we know. The flag was there, the America First flag. That's a very young online group of I guess what you can describe as white nationalist leaning youngsters. So we know of that. We know the guy in the Camp Auschwitz hoodie. And then somebody that I interviewed on January the 7th, for those of you who have been to my webpage, it's the top of the page, publicreport.org. There's a man who was in full black, kind of black ops gear, who showed up the next day on January 7th. He showed up at what was essentially the scene of the crime, right? This is outside the Capitol. New fencing had been put up. It was night on January 7th. He shows up, and I interview him for 30 minutes. You can see clips of that at publicreport.org. I posted very snippets on Twitter. It's tough to post the whole interview because he espouses essentially he says anti-communist, but he also says, quote, I don't have a problem with National Socialism. That is essentially neo-Nazi sympathizing. I asked him about diversity. He did not seem to think it worked. So this guy who is from California, I do not have his full name. I interviewed him, and that's on publicreport.org. So I know when I asked him if he was an extremist, he paused rather dramatically, and then he said yes. He said he was an extremist. So again, we know that these people are there, but the overwhelming populism of what we saw on January the 6th almost necessitates a new term of a sort of populist extremism that came out of January the 6th and is going to be harder to deal with unless we characterize it correctly. There are some people who are at the Capitol who are speaking out that they were there. And I think that those people should not be banished to the shadows of encrypted apps. I think we should get the story as to who was there, just like we should know who was at other riots that took place since May. I think that censoring the story or coming up with blanket narratives that are unfounded from what we can tell, because we do not have evidence of platform supremacist groups being involved. I think we do a disservice to us as a country in trying to figure out what this story is, especially when you have censorship running amok. Here was Ford Fischer, who had recorded near the ellipse, it sounded like what was over an hour of footage, and because he did not give it some sort of context, because he just let his camera roll and he just showed people what was going on, he's dealing with censorship from YouTube, from big tech, which is one of the grievances that those who were at the Capitol had, which is they felt that big tech censorship is something. The Latin Kings guy, okay, you have a name here. He was arrested days before on several charges. Days before what? You mean days before the actual? All right, I see a lot of dates going on here. I don't know what that's all about. You can maybe explain that. Let me answer another question. These aren't even questions. These are just statements I don't know. Alex Jones were tied into the riot. Yes, Alex Jones was quite obviously tied to it. I think that from what I saw, Alex Jones was there on December the 12th as well. He gave a big speech as the rain started to come down in front of, I believe it was the Marriott Hotel. And he's sort of this cult figure that would show up at different events. So it does not surprise me that he would be scrutinized as being instrumental in rhetorically, certainly. But it's really tough. When I look at my Twitter, people, especially there's a piece about Bullhorn Lady in the New Yorker. It characterizes her as a mother from Pennsylvania. And she speaks with the New Yorker. And it's an interesting piece because she's very active that day. The video that I shot inside when Bullhorn Lady comes in and she's sort of helicopter rioting, in the sense she's trying to get people to understand the layout. My impression was she had been in there because she said, quote, "There's broken glass in the other room." So if she's indicating that there's broken glass somewhere that we can't see from the room that I was in when I was filming her, that tells me that she was probably in there previously. That video was shot in the 5 o'clock hour. So it was very late. I was among, that was probably the last breach that there was where I filmed that video of the Bullhorn Lady. So the idea that my video would then be taken, and it first appeared online under a headline from CNN that said, U.S. says Capitol rioters planned to capture and assassinate elected officials. That's a bullshit headline. It just is. And all they had to do was call me up and talk to me, and they would have known that certainly my video couldn't be connected with anything like that. The group that I was observing was extremely disorganized. It only appeared that one person, who happened to be a person of color, was listening to Bullhorn Lady, and then in the next room bashed out. He had a big pole and he was bashing out. He had a MAGA hat on. He was bashing out the window in the next room. That one person seemed to be the only person, from what I could tell, that was listening to Bullhorn Lady. It was complete mayhem. I've said this before, that Twitter has reacted to my video as being, quote, high comedy, or a combination of Animal House meets Les Mis, where it's just people destroying ornate office furniture, trying to build some makeshift barricade of an imagined revolution. There are a lot of comments here by one person, and I don't even know where to start. So what I will say is that what that was great to have Ford on. The more conversations that I'm going to have with Ford, Brendan, Richie, who's with the Daily Caller, these are all people that, we've seen each other, in some cases been right next to each other filming at these different, episodes of Civil Unrest. When we start comparing notes, my hope is you'll get a better picture of what's been going on that is free from this just incessant spin from mass media that everybody seems to be getting. I didn't get a chance to mention to Ford, there was a New York Times headline that was about Antifa in the last couple of days that was extremely, the piece is extremely flawed because it classifies the Boogaloo as far right. Ford has been on record just in this last week. You can look up Ford Fischer in regards to the topic of Boogaloo, and you'll see that his assessment is much like mine, and really anybody who understands what's been going on out there. The Boogaloo is this hybrid, which is anti-government, and was very early on mistaken for ethno-nationalist right-winger. It's very much a hybrid, even though the meme itself came from a film called Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo. It was one of these memes, these jokes on lines that transmorphed and eventually became Civil War II, Electric Boogaloo. It was not taken up by ethno-nationalists. The Boogaloo are, from what we have been able to tell, misreported in mass media as right-wing, sometimes white supremacists, when they're very much sort of this anarcho-libertarian hybrid of people who are libertarian right, libertarian left, that come under this Boogaloo umbrella as part of this sort of pop culture phenomenon, which then translated out into the streets. And you had people showing up doing these sort of Second Amendment demonstrations with Hawaiian shirts on and weird patches and affiliations. And that varied from people who were very peaceful. The first Boogaloo I talked to was actually a black guy in Tulsa who was all about peaceful Second Amendment, representation or protest. And then you had Stephen Carrillo, who shoots and kills two officers over a period of a week at the end of May, taking cover and using the Oakland Black Lives Matter protests, the George Floyd protests, as cover to commit an act of murder. So it's a huge mixed bag that needs to be parsed. Also, with the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping plot, that is extremely complicated in the sense that you did have Trump supporters in that group that were a part of that Boogaloo kidnapping plot. But then you have many, according to Ford, who I just spoke with, he said most of the Boogaloo he's spoken with have been against Trump. So it does not fit neatly into left and right. Those of us who have been out there, who have interviewed these Boogaloo guys, understand that. So it's misreported essentially in the New York Times. Let me see if I can grab that headline. I think I screenshotted it, but it basically is a headline which tries to make the case that the Trump administration, you know what? I'm just going to Google it because I think I had it up a second ago. The article tries to make the case that the Trump administration neglected far-right extremism by focusing on Antifa. And a big part of that is the Boogaloo in their article, which is they misclassify as far-right. And a couple of authors I've seen done this. One of them is an anarchist author named Kim Kelly, and she writes about labor and anarchism. And I think it was, I can't remember which publication it was, but she wrote about Brandon Caserta. Brandon Caserta was basically the ringleader of the Michigan Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping plot. He has 2 flags behind him on a YouTube video. One of them is a heavy metal band. She wrote about white supremacy and heavy metal based on that heavy metal band flag. But the other flag on his other side is an anarchist flag. So she conveniently, as an anarchist, ignored the anarchist flag behind Brandon Caserta and focused only on the heavy metal flag. And it's a kind of I don't think I could think of a better example of, and this is an influencer with well over 100,000 followers, of selective journalism. Essentially, if you're going to ignore an anarchist flag but focus on a heavy metal flag and make an article about white supremacy or in the heavy metal scene, it's not an accurate article. And a lot of these boogaloo, what we found, are social justice aligned. They showed up in Minneapolis. And one anarchist posted, I just tweeted this a couple of days ago, a sort of an old school legacy anarchist in Minneapolis posted on Facebook how they kicked the boogaloo guys out because they were repping libertarian militia, which is essentially what those guys are. So they said they'd be interested in having a conversation at some point, but the boogaloo showed up saying they were sincere in their support for justice for George Floyd. And one of them, a fellow named Ivan Hunter, who was from Texas, was actually arrested for firing his rifle at the 3rd Precinct and shouting justice for George Floyd. So again, this New York Times piece about Antifa that came up was heavily centered around the boogaloo being part of the far right, which again is a misclassification. Interesting. I can't find it. Oh, no, here it is. How Trump's focus on Antifa distracted attention from the far right threat. That is the New York Times. I've asked, there's 3 authors on this piece, and I've asked them where they got the far right designation for the boogaloo, because that doesn't match up with what Ford has seen over the last couple of months, which I've seen out in the streets, and other folks. Andy No's book came out, and somebody from the left, you might find it problematic that I even reference it, but he does mention that the boogaloo is not is misclassified as far right as well. I am reading that book. It is important for me to know what's written. I think that Mr. No is involved in the story in a way that is unique and definitely he doesn't pretend that he's not a right-wing partisan. I've always said that, but I still am reading his book to see if there are, I understand that's who he is, what his perspective and political affiliation is, but that does not mean that the entire book is not worth reading. I am reading that book. I would be a fool not to. So anyways, thank you for the great encouraging comment there. I appreciate that. Someone brought up Q earlier, and the correspondence with the Chicago Project that authored the Atlantic piece. That correspondence does not mention Q. And that might be an interesting to say, hey, of the 193 people that you analyzed, how many were Q affiliated? Or that you could, because I don't think they use Q, that affiliation. So it'd be interesting to follow up with them on that. And I think I might do just that. But as I said, they said that only one person had any sort of ethno-nationalist affiliation, and it was a Latin Kings affiliation. So I find that interesting. I think Ford and I really he came up with, and he mentioned a group that I had been wondering if the Atlantic report would those who were published by the Atlantic, rather the Chicago Project report, whether they would have mentioned it. And that was that Nick Fuentes Groyper America First group, whether they would classify that as some sort of white nationalism. So, the evolution, and I want to talk to Ford about this more, from Charlottesville. And he really echoed what I've said before, which is I didn't realize that Charlottesville really decimated that alt-right white nationalist contingency, the Richard Spencer, Jason Kessler, that group of white nationalists. They were hit with legal problems. One expert that I talked to out of a Southern California university who's advised for Frontline, he told me early on that group was MIA. Richard Spencer himself, I think, was going through a divorce as well in the spring. And so they weren't out on the streets, as I had originally suspected, agitating at Black Lives Matter protests or anything like that. And so it came as no surprise to me when the Chicago Project, published by the Atlantic, when they said they couldn't find any white nationalist affiliations among the 193 people that were arrested inside the Capitol. Now that's a significant sampling. I think they say that 4 times as many were in the Capitol, but that 193 people were arrested, and we were able to parse the characterization of who those Capitol rioters who made it inside were, and that it's coming up, 0 when it comes to white supremacist affiliations. I think that's why the Southern Poverty Law Center couldn't answer me on Monday and still has not replied to me, even though I told them my deadline was yesterday. The reason they can't answer is because they've been talking about white supremacy, and they held a press conference surrounding it and mentioned the Capitol several times, and yet there's no evidence of actual white supremacist groups being involved, with the exception of the one that Ford and I just in this conversation theorized about. So the Atlantic piece, I highly recommend it. It's fascinating. Again, just Google the Atlantic and Capitol rioters, and the piece will come up, because they basically tell you these aren't the extremists you think these are. And it's a bigger problem in dealing with populist extremism. I've written a piece called A Culture of Extremists, and in which I think the media themselves have enabled a sort of extremism and a portrayal of extremism that is not accurate to what we were seeing on the street. That's both on the right and the left, the right-wing media and the left-wing media. I think it's completely blown it. And it'll be interesting, because these are themes that Ford speaks about as well. So when we get a chance to talk a little bit more, I think we're going to be able to expound on that. Let me look. Are there any actual questions? Is that a Tanuki Mario? Whoever this Tanuki Mario is, I don't see an actual question. I just see lots of words. So that was your message board. If anybody has an actual question, please feel free to ask it now. Otherwise, I'm going to sign off. I have a couple other conversations I'm supposed to have this week with different journalists. I basically took the last week and a half off to I kept researching, but kind of just decided to decompress. So I will be back. I'm supposed to have another conversation later in the next 24 hours. I will say that. When will you be casting again? I will be talking with more folks, and so I will be casting another broadcast sometime soon. I might be doing that next week, actually. So I'll check my Twitter, you guys. I have my Twitter, I have my Twitter handle right there. If you don't follow me on Twitter, follow me there. What I'm going to do is I'll be able to give you updates as far as who I'm talking to. For the most part, it's going to be other journalists, some who are out there, some who are not. I think that at this point, the mainstream media has decided, mass media has decided that really they don't want to talk to us in some way. I saw that with my video of the bullhorn lady. that there was no interest whatsoever. There was interest in what is called usage. So I got a ton of emails. What's that? Oh, cracked my back there. I'm gonna just have a refreshment. There were a lot, dozens of usage requests. And it all went down for me January the 13th, where I got an email from everybody. And these are all organizations who I had tried to pitch all of my writings, which I've been writing since May about what I've seen as far as leftist riot techniques. And I'd been writing about that, and all these publications weren't interested. The New York Times is the only publication that did a piece in which they interviewed me and referenced my work and research. But other than the New York Times, nobody was really interested. So all of a sudden, to get the Washington Post requesting video usage, I said no. It's like, if I could have said no any louder, or if I could have said no way, but I just gave them a professional no. I was not interested in a lot of these publications using my work, because at the time there was this narrative that was being spun that maybe Congress held tours, and there was just mass demonization. I would say deplatforming. I'm firmly against censorship, deplatforming of Parler, the whole thing. I don't think it makes us safer at all. I think we're less safe, because on Parler, I could see this was essentially populist extremism. It was all there out in the open, much like leftist Black Bloc is a populist extremism, form of populist extremism. Because what they're doing is they're telling you, go to Berkeley Antifa. Don't follow them. I don't want to get them new followers. But Berkeley Antifa, they blocked me months ago. Antifa Sacramento, which they have a weird handle. It's Antifa Sac and then underscore at the end. Those are legit populist extremist groups, in the sense that they have a cover from mainstream media, who doesn't cover what they do or criticize them, and the populace at large, which essentially, from elected officials to just kind of let them do what they do. So those two groups are interesting, because I followed them on October the 17th when they beat up Trump supporters in San Francisco. There was between 1,000 and 2,000 in the mass, and many were in Black Bloc. A guy with carbon fiber knuckle gloves punches out the two front teeth of Philip Anderson, who's a Black conservative activist. So they get a hate crime charge filed for October the 17th in San Francisco. Not a lot of people talk about that. That was another question I had to the Southern Poverty Law Center. What is your comment on the hate crime charge from October the 17th in San Francisco that went up against a Black Bloc practitioner who is led by Berkeley Antifa? I have nothing from the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center. I think we need to look at extremism in a different way. It cannot be a partisan view of right extremism and left extremism that is tied to political partisanship. I think extremism is extremism, and it needs to be looked at holistically, because if you see people getting away with extremism on the left and you're an extremist on the right, don't you think that's going to ignite more extremism on your side from like-minded extremist groups, and vice versa? Doesn't the left see extremism on the right, and aren't they motivated like that? Because that's essentially what we have, is we have a cycle of violence, of gangism, which has enveloped this country. And it's specifically political violence that started on the left. Where I'm from, the Bay Area specifically, the first instances of political violence at the end of 2016, right when Trump was elected, you had rioting in San Francisco on election night. That week, you had rioting in Oakland the entire week. I don't want to say the entire week, but on more than one day, you had Oakland riots in response to Trump's election. In Washington, D.C., on January the 19th, 2017, the Deplorable was attacked. The Deplorable was this right-wing personality event that had this campy name, and this was in Washington, D.C., and they were physically attacked and had bottles thrown at them by Black Bloc. I've posted video of Black Bloc anarchists chanting "Anarchy Now" and foreclose the White House. So when it comes to the physical attacking of political violence under Trump, it comes from us on the left. I say us because I'm not a Trump. I was against Trump, so because this is populist extremism, and that's my new sort of understanding of this, that the Atlantic article really backs up. I think we need to start thinking of extremism in terms of collective responsibility and not in terms of, well, your side did this and your side did that, and going back and forth. I don't think it's going to get us anywhere. Let's see. How useful are left and right as reference points in understanding all this? Well, I think maybe I addressed that a little bit. I don't know that, again, I think we need to take a new approach, especially if you're a hate watch group like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League, which I was assigned representatives to work with. But once they found out that the extremism didn't come from the right, they weren't interested anymore. And I don't think that's a way that we should work as a society trying to address hate. It's not good if it's from the right. It's not good if it's from the left. I personally think, in terms of left and right, that if you're on the left, like me, you should come down on your own side harder, because that's where you are most familiar. So that's the difference. One person asked, well, what's the difference between you and Andy Ngo? Well, Andy Ngo is in the Pacific Northwest. He's in it. He's involved. My experience is more San Francisco Bay Area, some Southern California, and then I travel around across the country. So, but the big difference is that he looks at it from a right perspective at everything that's wrong with the left. I look at it from a left perspective of here's what's wrong on both sides. So I think that we need to get beyond the left and right reference points. That would be my answer to that question. In understanding all this, I think we need to address extremism as extremism from either side. I think you're going to be most effective. Look, just by addressing it, you get attacked. That's what I learned. I got attacked on Twitter early on. I got attacked, it just sort of goes with the territory. I got attacked from friends on Facebook, real life friends who didn't want to talk to me anymore. So when you deal with it on your own side, there is fallout, and that sucks. But I think we all need to start taking responsibility for our quote unquote own sides. Personally, that's my you don't play into their narrative. Thank you for that. Yeah, I don't think we should play into narratives. I think it's scary the way they're painting the right now. I think that I think a lot of it's exaggerated. I think that when it comes to counter domestic terror legislation, this is stuff that if you're activists on the left, you don't want either. There's a lot of demonization that's going on right now, and persecution. And maybe I haven't said this enough on Twitter, because people are always asking me questions about the guy with the grizzled beard who walked up to me and wanted me to film. They call him Swedish Scarf Guy. I called him Fogarty because he's the one who said, it ain't me, I ain't Joe Biden's son. And he flipped the gas mask on and went out to charge into the hallway. I don't know that you benefit as a society by persecuting. Look, if people did stuff that was illegal, especially if they took part in violent actions, sure, they should face consequences. But I don't know that hunting down every single person who was in the Capitol, I'm not sure what we benefit from that, because as I said, it was the way that I've watched these populist riots, the civil unrest play out since May. You don't go after, they don't get every person who was, at the Portland ICE facility. They don't get any of them in some cases, or outside the federal courthouse in Portland. Now, I'm not trying to make an equivalency of causes. I'm saying that if we're going to really address the problems, it's not about persecuting everybody as a quote unquote seditionist, and coming down on trying to persecute a whole populist wing of ideology. If you're talking about conservatives, and using it to score political points. I just don't think that that's where we need to go. So I've never been anybody who's encouraged really these sort of Twitter hunts that go on and trying to nail every person that was inside there. I personally don't think that every person that was inside there was a threat. I actually think few of them probably were. There were probably people who are on the more advanced coordinating side. The interview that I had with a guy from California on publicreport.org, the first person that you see right now, if you go to my website, I posted it on my Twitter as well. That person is a very interesting person. I would love to interview that person again to find out more. I don't know how that will ever happen, but I think that is a person of interest that might be able to shed light on the story. So if you're talking about, would the Swedish scarf grizzly beard guy be able to shed more light on the story, then I'm sure the FBI is interested in interviewing him. I would be interested in interviewing him if they do find out who it is. But I'm not a person, because I can't all of a sudden switch into some sort of persecutorial mode and say to everybody on Twitter that's trying to hunt down everybody that was there. That's not what I'm telling. I'm telling the story, and part of my story isn't the Andy No thing, which Andy No is trying to, point at people and say this person is this, and his book is called Unmasked. So he's a very different approach than I do. I'm not trying to get people arrested. That's not what I think a journalist. Well, look, there are some cases when it comes, again, when it comes to violence against a person, actual harm. Obviously the authorities have contacted me. A lot of people have tweeted this at me. Yes, the authorities did get in contact with me early on and had questions, and I showed them my content, and I also, as an assessment, said what I saw was extremely disorganized. It also seemed like autonomous action. Autonomous action is the phrase that was used by the left in characterizing Minneapolis, that you had autonomous groups that were essentially improvising in the riot action. And that's what I saw at the Capitol. It was the same type of autonomous action, even though on Twitter, armed insurrection trended, there were only 3 gun arrests on the Capitol grounds, one by MPD, the Metropolitan Police Department, and 2 other by the Capitol Police. Capitol Police has not been able to tell me if either of those 2 arrests took place inside the Capitol itself. Did a gun ever make it inside the Capitol? I think that's interesting, especially considering the demographic of who we thought was there, even though 1 in 10 only were militia types of the arrestees. I think it's interesting that there's only 2 arrests in which it was possible that carrying without a license was actually the citation inside the Capitol. The Metropolitan Police Department's arrest took place it's marked as Capitol Visitors Center. So it's it's interesting because I think the story that you got early on is indicative of a pipeline that's Twitter to tabloid to TV. This is what I saw from my video. That my video was first grabbed by Twitter and Twitter activists, made to look like an advance in narrative of widespread coordination. The Capitol rioters knew more in advance than we thought. That was what my video was used for. It wasn't true. If you'd asked me, I would have told you, nope, they looked like none of them knew each other and they were just totally just breaking shit on the fly. That's what it looked like to me. But they didn't even care. They didn't even interview me. A couple did. What CBS did, and I told them, they called me up and they said, yeah, we're doing a story on how well coordinated this is. And I said, well, my video is not going to help you because what I saw wasn't well coordinated at all. It was edited to look that way by an activist on Twitter that took all of the exciting parts, smashed them together, and made it look like there was coordination. When you cut the bullhorn lady talking about the layout and you directly go to a guy smashing out a window, it looks a lot more coordinated than it really was. So this pipeline that I'm talking about, Twitter to tabloids. So then it's picked up. For me, the Raw story took it, the Daily Dot, the Sun removed it. As soon as I told them that their content that they were using was not approved, they removed it. So kudos to the Sun. Of all these tabloids, the Daily Mail, that's the big one. They took a ton of my images and used them without my authorization. I was in discussion with them, but I never sent them the images. They just took it outright and had their way with it. There was no discussion about what would be used. Nothing was finalized. I have not accepted a penny yet for this, but I do plan to hold some of these outlets in account for taking my videos. So we'll see how that goes. So the tabloids pick it up. It's pirated on Twitter. A false narrative is propagated. That narrative begins trending on Twitter. We saw this also on the 6th in regards to race. The narrative that if these were Black people, they would have been shot with live rounds. That was tweeted on January the 6th in the 2 p.m. hour. So that was before people knew that Ashley Babbitt was shot and killed with a live round. So these narratives are spun by Twitter activists. Video is appropriated because you can steal whatever you want on Twitter, according to them. And I don't agree with it, And so this video is appropriated. Then it makes the tabloids. Then the television stations take from the tabloids. So once they see it on the Raw story or on the Daily Mail, then CNN or MSNBC then pluck it, and all of a sudden it becomes truth, when in reality, it's not. What else do we got here? What do you say to someone friends that say what the left is doing is nothing like what the right did at the Capitol? I mean, your what's that? I think the trick to try to talk about this is that you have to start talking about it. You have to say, okay, let's take away the cause. Let's take away what we believe to be just, what we believe to be righteous, because people will do anything in the terms of righteousness. And that's where the left is probably, you're running into trouble, is that you're getting this false equivalency that you're not even trying to make, probably, about whose cause is just. So if you can take that out of the conversation, and then you can talk just in terms of populist techniques and how social media, how the web has essentially been involved in populist radicalization, populist extremism, that when we look at the instruments that are used at the Capitol, again, only 2 gun arrests that possibly could have been within the Capitol. Now, there were 6 overall, but 3 of them were a mile away, 1 to 2 miles away, all the way on the other side of town. So when you start talking about, you have to talk about the facts, and that there were 6 arrests for people carrying without a permit. 3 of them were 1 to 2 miles away from the Capitol. One of them is marked Metropolitan Police Department Visitor Center. That means there's 2 by Capitol Police that could have gotten into the Capitol. If that means there's only 2 possibilities, none confirmed, no photos, that means that this wasn't an armed insurrection. So because armed insurrection trends on Twitter, that's what people have in their mind. So if you can address that wasn't true, and then the white supremacy thing. 1 out of 10 of the arrestees, according to the Chicago Project that is published on The Atlantic, 1 out of 10 had some sort of Proud Boys, militia, 3%ers, oath keepers, rather, affiliation. Well, that's a small amount of that. That's 1 out of 10 of the people that were at the tip of the spear there getting into the Capitol. That means that 90% were the extremism came out of populism. So you start making comparisons on these other characteristics. And again, you can't engage on whose has the just cause and whose beliefs are more valid. Because at the end of the day, people believe what they believe, and I know that the only way that I'm going to engage with people who are of a different political frame of mind than me is if we don't get into who's right. And if you get the conversation off of that, you actually start to talk about where there are these similarities, not only in just characteristics of civil unrest and quote unquote riot action. There's also disenfranchisement, even though you might say, okay, well, this group is white privilege. And that's where the narrative is going now, because one woman was granted that she could go on a vacation to Mexico that she had already booked, even though she was arrested at the Capitol. So now the narrative is going to, okay, we didn't find any white supremacist groups, but this is a white privilege riot. Okay, if people want to have that conversation and harp on that, then you can. But essentially, what the group from the right and left have in common, as I held this New Year's Eve discussion between a Proud Boys leader and a Black Lives Matter leader, they realized they had 7 points of agreement when it came to police reform, prison reform, getting big money out of politics, combating sex trafficking in the internet age, dealing with housing. They had all of these points of agreement. So if we can focus on where these populist, disenfranchised or people won't even let me use the word disenfranchisement because they say of the right, well, these people had jobs. That's what's also interesting is a lot of them were employed. And we're going back 40%. We're going back to either white collar or business ownership. A lot of them were over 40. The majority were over 40. So the demographic of who was there at the Capitol, you say people will say, well, you can't even use disenfranchisement. No, it's like, okay, all right, fine. I won't use that word disenfranchisement. But there's something that they're motivated by in which there are ills in society that they are, a big part of this, in my personal opinion, is that we have not accurately covered Black Bloc. And if people see ninjas jumping around every which way in certain cities, burning things down, then they think it's some sort of, anarcho-communist takeover. And they don't realize how disorganized and autonomous that extreme left populist movement is as well. So how do you have that conversation? Man, it is tough. And I think if you try to look at who are these people? If you can get people on the left to realize that these weren't white nationalists, and we're getting the evidence now that these were not platform white supremacy groups. And then they'll say, okay, well, then I say that they're white privilege. Well, okay, fine. But ultimately, what we have to sort of acknowledge is, well, what are these people rioting, or what are they are railing against big tech? They were railing against media demonization. This is all stuff that if you're on the left, you shouldn't want, right? We shouldn't want censorship. I would think. I know that there's a strain on the left of sort of protectionism that thinks that, but if you honestly look at who these people were, they were not ethno-nationalists. They were not the Charlottesville, as Ford and I talked about. They were not that group. So they don't have to be every thought doesn't have to be censored. Now, where does this Q stuff, come from? Obviously, it's an issue. I don't think banishing it to the corners of encrypted chat rooms is the best thing. I think as it was splitting the right to Parler and then, other people on Facebook or Twitter, I don't think that was good to begin with, in the sense that I think we should be engaging with people who are, I have a friend, a guy I played music with, who believes in like Pizzagate stuff. And it's just like, yeah, how do you, the idea is, if you put enough of hopefully, you don't kick somebody to the curb, but you put forward enough information in which you say, hey, I'm sympathetic to the fact that the mainstream media is blowing it, and they don't know what they're doing, and they are not just partisan, but just inaccurate and not doing journalism. So I'm sympathetic to that, but that doesn't mean you need to go all the way over there. Come back. I just think staying engaged is important. That's just my philosophy. So can't seem to get peers away from CNN. Yeah, I mean that's a tough one, because CNN has essentially become a tabloid, And when you get involved to a point of where your objectivity becomes secondary to your feud with the president of the United States, it's tough. It's really tough to get people away from that and just engage. But there has to be, more material. I would suggest this article in the Atlantic. The Capitol rioters aren't like the extremists. The exact headline I know I have at the tip of my tongue here. The full headline is Capitol rioters aren't like other extremists. I think that's good content. I think it's interesting content. I think almost people were too emotional in those first weeks. That's what I was told, was not even to really submit my work, but take some time off, because it was just too raw for people. And there may be some truth to that, So it was an interesting article you tweeted yesterday in regards to the type of people. Yeah, that's that article in the Atlantic. And for those of you who are new or just joining me, this is an exclusive. I mean, in the sense that I contacted the author of the Chicago Project. I repeated this earlier, but I'll repeat it one more time if anybody's new. The Chicago Project on Security and Threats. This is one of the senior research associate director. His name is Kevin Ruby, PhD. And this is part of University of Chicago. And so I contacted them, and I said, and because the Southern Poverty Law Center couldn't give me an answer as to whether or not there were any platform white nationalists, white supremacist groups at the Capitol on January 6th, I asked them. And again, this is what he said. He said, there was only one person among the 193 arrested for attacking the Capitol with any gang. And he said, the chart does not specify the type. On the chart, they said 1%, but that meant of the 193, only one person. They rounded up. And he goes on to say, the gang in question is the Latin Kings, not a white nationalist gang. We found no evidence of specifically white nationalist gangs, parentheses, skinheads, hammerskins, Aryan Brotherhood, etc., among the arrested. So that's a little addendum to that Atlantic article, the Capitol rioters aren't like other extremists, that I got directly from them. I think it's significant. I think it's very interesting. And again, per Ford in my conversation, that doesn't mean white nationalist types or, ethno-nationalists weren't there. It just means they weren't there in an organized capacity. And the reaction has been that we're dealing with it on this massive, organized, white supremacist, insurrectionary scale. So that's that. Okay, thank you for the compliments. Let's see, who's in charge of security? Where are we talking about? I don't know what that is reference to. 1 second. Please leave the scope up. Okay, I'll leave it up. Where can others find this post? You can look at my YouTube as well. I have a YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Unblocked Podcast. This is my Twitter handle here at JLQ Lee Quinn. I will leave this up. You can go to Unblocked Podcast or youtube.com/Unblocked Podcast. There's also a Facebook page. I don't use it that much, but it's facebook.com/Unblocked Pod. I'm Jeremy Lee Quinn. You can find me on Facebook too. My Facebook, Jeremy Lee Quinn, facebook.com/Jeremy Lee Quinn. You can connect with me directly there on Facebook as well. So I'm streaming on all those platforms right now in this discussion. So I am, let's see, what else we got here? You're doing one thing. I don't understand what that means. Why would that not be reported everywhere? I just don't get it. I don't get why a lot of this isn't. A lot of it, okay, this is what I will say. A reason that I think the journalism has been skewed is you're getting all of this Twitter influence, and a lot of it is emotional perspective and emotional reaction to January the 6th. Instead of being journalists where we talk to the people who were there. And again, the New Yorker piece is good. Actually, I think that's Ronan Farrow who wrote the New Yorker piece, who talked to Bullhorn Lady from my video. He talked to somebody who was there. That counts as journalism. If you go to publicreport.org/capital, capital with an O, I think lowercase, I have capital up at the top of the banner. If you go to that page, I talked to several people who were there. One of the first people to enter the Capitol on the West Side were called praying grandmas, and they were very open that they had gotten in. I talked to a right-wing video journalist who is an acquaintance who I've seen from the field in Washington, D.C. and kept in contact with. He goes by Villain Report. He's a right-wing guy, but somebody who, because he's from the Pacific Northwest, he doesn't show his face, which is interesting. But I've corresponded with, I interviewed him as he was coming out. He was right next to a woman who died. I'm sorry, her name was Roseanne. The names are starting to fade from my memory. Incidentally, that night of January the 7th, I did a joint live stream with him, and we saw makeshift memorials go up that were in honor of the 4 people we didn't know at that time of the police officer who had died. But people who were of the Patriot affiliation, who were probably Trump supporters, had put up makeshift memorials near the Capitol for, again, it was known to be 4 people on the night of January the 7th. This is before we found out about Officer Sicknick's death. And interestingly enough, those memorials were taken down quickly because 2 days later I returned and they were gone. I'm just putting that information out there. But people and the extremist, the self-described extremist who told me that he had studied hours of tape from the left, that happened on the 7th with those. You can actually see in my interview with him the vigil area where candles were lit and these makeshift memorials were put up originally for the 4 people who were Patriot aligned of that of that riot / protest. So that's just some information that you'll see if you go to publicreport.org and you see that first interview that's posted up at the top. What's my future direction? I'm going to do a couple more of these. I mean, I'm at home now. I put this studio up. This is a brand new sort of webcam. It has better resolution than when I talked to Brett Weinstein. My first conversation with Brett Weinstein, I was in a hollow room. I didn't have a good mic. I finally have a good mic. This can actually be done for low cost, like less than $300. You can get yourself a mic, a good webcam, and a ring light. So I can have more of these discussions, and I would like to do that. I would like my future direction. I think this podcast, the Unblocked Podcast, even though it's really nothing right now, it could be something that I could build on. I would like to keep interviewing people and having discussions. I came in under fire from the left because I interviewed Enrique Tarrio of the Proud Boys. Well, that turned out to be a very interesting interview, not just because he would later get arrested before the Capitol riot for carrying an ammo cartridge, but he also turns out to be someone who was a former FBI informant. So as you make calculations. When I took 3 months before I published my interview with Enrique Tarrio, which you can find on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Unblocked Podcast. Before I published that, I waited 3 months because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't platforming somebody who was not what they said they were, And so I did a lot of research before I let that interview come out. Now, I let it come out at a time where other mainstream, a reporter named Will from USA Today had just interviewed Tarrio as he was getting arrested. Jorge Ramos had a conversation with Enrique Tarrio the evening of January the 6th. I assume he was outside of Washington, D.C. because he was banned from Washington, D.C. But Jorge Ramos took him and they had a discussion together on Univision, which is a network that I used to work for. I'm still on their freelance role. So I may go back to work for them if, I was furloughed back in May. So I've been on leave essentially. So what is my future direction? Do I want to write about this more? I do. I want to have more discussions like this. Even though Ford was on just for a little bit, you can kind of get a glimpse of what it's like when all of a sudden you get 2 or 3 or 4 guys together who've been there this whole way. What a window that is. And because then we're not by ourselves. All of a sudden there's 3 or 4 of us, and we might not agree on everything, but our approach, and another guy named Brendan Gutenschwager, if you don't follow him on Twitter, check him out. There's a couple of us that are true independents. We don't really answer to anybody. And so our work has not has been really for the sake of just getting out the objective truth. So have you researched the Latin Kings? I haven't researched it. I just got that information within the last hour. So you're getting that information fresh. I will look into that. But it sounds like an ethno street gang that of sorts, but it doesn't. But again, when one person is arrested who has that affiliation, that doesn't necessarily mean that organization, that gang was involved, because the guy was just by himself. He wasn't there with 2 or 3 other guys from the gang. That just means, all that means is that a person who was of that gang happened to be arrested. So I'll pursue it, but and look into it, but I don't even know that necessarily says anything about that gang per se. Thank you for the compliments, you guys, because there have been moments, there have been lows with this. There have been, sleepless nights. There have been, there's all this pushback, and then you get negative energy, of course, from Twitter. You have people tweeting your name with the FBI saying that I should be arrested just because I was there, which of course is, as a journalist, you need to know what was happening there. You need to know we have a job to do, and that's it. So there are bad faith actors out there. I was just talking about my interview with Enrique Tarrio. I tried very much. There's this journalist from the Pacific Northwest. She calls herself a journalist. I mean, I don't want to, but it's important she's an Antifa aligned journalist. So that's important to denote because I consider it somewhat, if you're embedded with Antifa, that you are towing a propaganda line. And I have invited her to debate me. And one of her answers was, no, you talk to Enrique Tarrio. So I can't, that's irresponsible. Well, no, that was journalism. He's an interesting, important figure. And I did press him. It wasn't a softball interview. So when the most resistance I come up with is from the activist left. I'm very excited. I'm going to be having a discussion with an activist from the left next week. So stay tuned for that, because I do have one person who's going to engage with me, I think it's going to provoke a very interesting conversation. That's all I'll say, because I want to make sure it happens first. But that's going to be next Monday. So tell your friends, follow me on my Twitter handle. Follow me on Facebook or YouTube. Please subscribe, because I want to have more of these conversations. And thank you again. First time I've watched live or on a pod. Well, thank you. I'm glad that this question answered. Okay, good. I'm glad we're answering some of these questions. And I will be debating somebody from the left, which is great, because I consider that my home too. And I'm going to talk about solutions too, because this is somebody who's an activist aligned with Black Lives Matter. A big thing on my Twitter, one of the first things that you'll see on my Twitter is that I talk about getting more people into home ownership. When you get into neighborhoods that are underserved and communities that are underserved, you have to ask yourself, how can we get more people into home ownership? Isn't that going to be the key? And what is the main obstacle? What is the number one obstacle that prevents people? Let's say you work at FedEx. Let's say you've worked for them for 20 years. What makes you a renter and not a homeowner? Well, it's not having that 20% down payment. Wherever you live, that can vary. Obviously, if you're in Los Angeles like me, 20% down payment on something, that's, tens of thousands of dollars. So how can we expand down payment assistance programs? I know that they do that in Los Angeles and in Denver on a very small scale. So how can we think bigger to get home ownership up in neighborhoods where home ownership is down? Because once you get home ownership up, then business ownership and entrepreneurship can follow. So I called that initially a progressive capitalist idea, prog cap. Since then, someone has informed me that there is a California congressman who considers himself prog cap as well. I want to explore more ideas. Is it true that Patriot Front was out there that day? I don't think Patriot Front, and let's let people know who Patriot Front is. Patriot Front is a rebranding of the very same white nationalist group that was in Charlottesville, that James Fields, who drove his car into the crowd and killed Heather Heyer, he was holding one of their shields. I think it used to be called American Vanguard. I should look that up. Make sure I didn't name the wrong white nationalist group. But there was this group that became Patriot Front. Ford Fischer, who I just talked with, he's photographed Patriot Front. If you go to his Ford, follow Ford, by the way, on Twitter. If you go back just this week on Twitter, Patriot Front marched this last week. I don't know that they were there on January the 6th, but they marched this last week in Washington, D.C. Ford details how they're very secretive. They're almost like a pop-up kind of white nationalist group that shows up with those white coverings on their face, and they have their flags, and they don't say anything. It's really freaking creepy. If you want the full creepy effect, turn up turn up the volume. On my J. Lee Quinn Twitter, I posted, you only have to scroll back a couple days and you'll see the videos of Patriot Front marching just this last week in Washington, D.C. Those are actual white nationalist, white supremacists. And they're weird. They're just weird and creepy, and they don't say anything, and you hear their flags flapping, their weird flags. Those are neo-Nazis, and as far as I know, they weren't involved on January the 6th. And I've seen video of them being kicked out by the white nationalist group that we called the Groypers that Ford and I were talking about. I saw a video of them in December, a weird Patriot Front guy with a Patriot Front flag being kicked out by the Nick Fuentes Groyper group. So, so when you get to white nationalist, actual white supremacist, neo-Nazi, then the white nationalist light is kicking them out. So there's all these weird sort of layers, but when you get to the real deal, thank God nobody wants any part of that shit. So that's good. So you have to look on Ford's Twitter, and you can see he filmed them a year ago and actually interviewed their leader, who was just this weird guy from Texas. And so that's on Ford's Twitter very recently in the last week. Anything else? Was there any reports of police provocateurs? Yeah. So you guys might know about Jaden X. Jaden X was a left-wing social justice, Black Lives Matter, Antifa aligned, though Antifa disavows him. In the activist community, a lot of the Antifa groups say that Jaden X, his name was John Sullivan, is not a part of left Antifa. Now, you can be not a part of leftist Antifa and still be a social justice aligned anarchist, or somebody who's there as a quote unquote chaos agent. And we saw that, just like you had Umbrella Man, who is from the right, who was participating in the Minneapolis riots. So you had Jaden X, or John Sullivan, somebody who's a Black social justice aligned anarchist type, participating in the right. So those are outliers. Those are very fringe figures, because they're fringe. You have the fringe. I think it was a conversation with Brett in which Brett Weinstein said you have the fringe, then you have the fringe of the fringe, which means if you have like the fringe militia types or those that were in the Capitol, then you have the fringe of that, where you have a guy with a Camp Auschwitz hoodie on. So then you have the fringe of the fringe of the fringe, which is this sort of Jaden X, and Umbrella Man in Minneapolis. These guys who are basically, if we look at things in terms of right and left, we see them as infiltrators or chaos agents of sort. So the Antifa of the right is the way I see it. My point being, there are extremists on both sides. Yeah, there are. And, when you really get down to the nitty gritty, there are Stalinists on the left. They're called tankies. And these are, I give this guy too much attention. He had long hair. He was in Denver, and he had a Joseph Stalin tattoo on his shoulder. That's fringe, I would say. Just like you have, white supremacists, like neo-Nazis, are very fringe. And the Atlantic article clarifies that a little. And we should know that. We should know what we're dealing with and characterize things honestly as journalists. So they are weird and scary. Yeah, no, I mean, the white supremacist Patriot Front, are scary to anyone from a Jewish background for sure. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, the real white nationalists and hate groups, and this is something that, now let me take the Southern Poverty Law Center, who I've been critical of. This is something that they and the Anti-Defamation League are, understandably focused on, which is white supremacist groups that have mass shootings. I mean, we have 3 incidents that I can think of over the Trump presidency, which were race hate related mass shootings. And it's important, this is where the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I'm coming at them with all this other stuff, but they're like, hey, now also remember this. There was a shooting in El Paso, in Pittsburgh, and in a synagogue in Poway, which is Southern California near San Diego. So we do have these incidents that loom large. Even Dylan Roof. Now here's something really, really interesting. Donald Trump announced his run for presidency when he came down the escalator and all of that, and talked about Mexicans being rapists, and that was on June the 16th, 2015. Within 24 hours was the Dylan Roof shooting, in which he killed 9 people at a black church in, South Carolina. That happened within 24 hours. I can't help but think, in somewhere in our collective subconscious, especially those of us who see, since Charlottesville, just see white supremacists in every Trump supporter. I say those of us because I think I used to think that way, in a certain extent. I didn't really talk to Trump supporters as much until this last summer, until I went to Tulsa. So I think that I referenced that Dylan Roof, thing happening at the same time as Trump announcing his presidency. In some way, I think they're inextricable from one another and maybe our subconscious. I just wanted to, there's no sort of hard evidence of that, obviously. I'm just suggesting that when these white supremacist mass murders have happened, Dylan Roof, and the 3 examples I named, El Paso, Pittsburgh, and Poway, that they loom large. And certainly if you're the ADL, if you're the Southern Poverty Law Center, I understand why they loom large. Now, what I'm saying is we have to be able to do a couple things at once. And one of them is, because the comment that I was given, and I'm taking this out of context, Michael at the Southern Poverty Law Center said to me that it was offensive to suggest that Antifa-aligned types of actions can be compared to this other stuff. And I would agree. I mean, that's not what I was saying at all. But that I even brought up leftist extremism, and all of a sudden these other things were being hurled as saying, hey, we're not talking about leftists, we're talking about this. Well, these are all different things, and we have to be able to parse them and deal with them differently. In other words, you have these leftist attacks where I was there when people were attacked by Antifa Sacramento and Berkeley Antifa, October the 17th, December the 5th in Sacramento. I saw a couple beaten. We've seen the videos at civil unrest protests in Kenosha where the shop owner is trying to put out his business with an extinguisher and gets clubbed from behind. In Rochester, New York, there's a woman who's attacked by 4 people. So we've seen this stuff happen. We can deal with that. We could talk about that extremism, which is Antifa extremism or civil unrest extremism. We can also talk about the examples of white supremacy mass shootings, and we should monitor those. And then we also need to talk about this populist extremism that came out of Trumpism, which we saw on January the 6th. Those are 3 very different things. But if you lump everything together into just a racial lens of white supremacy, then you're not going to get very far, because you're not actually going to the ground and telling the story and talking to people who are there and understanding. And we're getting a very slow trickle understanding because, major media institutions aren't talking to people like Ford, like me, who were there. Instead, they're coming in with their own lens and they're running with it. That's it. People ask why Jaden wasn't arrested. He was arrested, I thought. I thought that he was. The SBC. I'd work with the Southern Poverty Law Center. I would love. I mean, I just think one of the issues is that if activism and because they actually consider themselves journalists, they have journalists at the Southern Poverty Law Center. So the question is where journalism and activism, where you're honest about being an activist. I would say I'm an activist for peace. I want people to talk to each other. I'm an activist against censorship, So if you're honest about where your activism is, and it doesn't prevent you from looking at the full picture, but rather it informs your ability to look at the full picture, then I would say that activism can be helpful. The problem is if we focus, if you're a hate watch group, and your activism is focused only on one side of the political spectrum, and you're not looking at the other side the reasoning that you're giving for not looking at the other side is, well, we have all this other stuff. It's not, in my opinion, that's not going to help because ultimately this stuff is cyclical. I think the extremists on the right see extremism on the left and they respond to it, just like extremists on the left see extremism on the right and they respond to it. And it's this endless cycle, which goes back in my first conversation with Brett Weinstein. I get into that a little. It goes back to the anti-racist action days, and that quote from the anarchist insider from the Midwest. He said, when we ran out of neo-Nazis, he said we made them up. And they would go after college Republicans. Next thing you know, mainstream college Republicans are being called Nazis and what have you. So they might have even been white nationalists. I don't know. I'm not defending anything. I'm just saying that the violence is cyclical. When you attack, if your motto is punch Nazis in the face, and you're punching more than just Nazis in the face, then that's going to boomerang back. That's been my point with all this, is that, on New Year's Eve, we talked about, in that conversation with Jakari Kelly, Black Lives Matter, Northern Utah, and a Proud Boy named Thad, we talked about, when's this going to boomerang back? Will it boomerang back? And the concern was that people have military training, on the right. And we're not talking about white nationalists necessarily. We're talking about, again, this populist right movement, or this populist extremism, I guess, that was at the Capitol. What are your thoughts on the Proud Boys being designated a terror group in Canada? Do you think that this decision will carry over to the US? So what I know about the Proud Boys in Canada, in that conversation with Thad, he told me that the uncensored Proud Boys channel is actually Canadian. So a lot of the hate that we are attributing to the Proud Boys, according to the Proud Boy that we talked to on New Year's Eve, comes from Canada. So I don't know how in depth that is, and as far as if there's something totally different in Canada that I just don't know about. But domestic terrorism designations on what are essentially extremist activism, essentially, because the Proud Boys were formed as a security detail because these right-wing provocateurs going to college campuses were being attacked. And, I don't want to get too much into the history of the Proud Boys, but that's how they came about. I don't know if something is different in Canada. I'm not familiar with Canadian Proud Boys culture. I don't think that its decision can carry over to the US. I don't think we want it to. I don't think designating groups as terrorists is going to help in any way with what we're dealing with, because we're dealing with cultural polarization on a much larger scale that goes beyond just calling this group of people a terrorist. I don't think it will carry over. I don't think it should. That's my opinion. So I'm gonna call it, guys. That was, wow, I've been talking for 2 hours, and I'm supposed to, do another interview at some point. But stay updated with me. Connect with me on YouTube. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'm going to try to do a lot more of these now that I've settled down and I'm not traveling. I'm going to try to have a lot more provocative, interesting conversations with people who've been around this topic. So please subscribe if you're on Facebook. It's facebook.com/unblockedpod. On YouTube, it's youtube.com/unblockedpodcast. And keep the questions coming. I like the interaction, and hopefully we'll be able to get some more information your way as this story continues to unfold, because there's going to be a lot of reflection on this. I think the story will remain very present in all our minds throughout the next four years at least. So thanks for joining me. Thanks to Ford Fischer. Follow him on, it's his name, Ford Fischer, on Twitter, and mine is at JLee Quinn. This has been Unblocked Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Take care.